My name is Frank Thompson, and I'm 69 years old, sitting here in the small Detroit apartment that I can barely afford, staring at a bank statement that shows a balance of $37.14. 6 months ago, that same account held $45,000. My entire life, savings accumulated over 43 years of working at the Ford Motor Company. Today, I'm nearly broke because while I was lying unconscious on an operating table having emergency hip surgery, my own son cleaned out every penny I had, leaving me with nothing but medical bills and the crushing realization that the person I trusted most in this world was nothing more than a thief. I'd love to hear where you're listening from today, so please share your location in the comments. And if my story touches something in your heart, I hope you'll consider subscribing, because what happened to me is happening to vulnerable seniors across America every day, and their voices need to be heard. Let me take you back to the beginning, to help you understand how a father's love and trust can be twisted into something so cruel and devastating. I worked for Ford for over 4 decades, starting on the assembly line when I was 22 years old and eventually working my way up to shift supervisor. It was honest, hard work that paid well enough to support my family and allowed me to save a little each month for retirement. My wife Helen and I raised 2 children in a modest house on Detroit's east side. Our daughter Sarah moved to California after college and built a successful career as a nurse practitioner. She calls regularly, visits when she can, and has always been a responsible one in the family. Our son Danny was different from the start. He was charming and clever, but he always seemed to be looking for the easy way out of any situation. Helen passed away from lung cancer 8 years ago, and losing her nearly destroyed me. She was my anchor, my voice of reason, and my best friend for 37 years. After her funeral, I fell into a deep depression that lasted for months. Danny stepped up during that dark time, helping with arrangements, checking on me regularly, and slowly bringing me back to life. I was so grateful for his support that I convinced myself he had finally matured into the man I always hoped he would become. For the past 8 years, Danny has been my primary companion and support system. He's 41 years old, divorced, and works sporadically in construction when he can find jobs. He's struggled financially for most of his adult life, and I've helped him out more times than I can count. I paid for his apartment deposit when he got evicted, covered his car repairs when he couldn't afford them, and even lent him money for child support when his ex-wife threatened to have him arrested. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. Danny would show up at my door with a sob story about some emergency or unexpected expense, and I would write him a check because I loved him and wanted to help. He always promised to pay me back, and sometimes he actually did, but more often than not, the loans became gifts that we both pretended to forget about. But I never suspected that Danny would steal from me outright. Despite his financial struggles and his history of making poor decisions, I never imagined that my own son would deliberately rob me of my life savings. I trusted him completely, and that trust would prove to be the biggest mistake of my life. The trouble started in November, when I began experiencing severe pain in my right hip. At first, I attributed it to age and the wear and tear of 40 years of physical labor, but the pain became so intense that I could barely walk from my bedroom to the kitchen. Danny drove me to several doctor appointments, and after x-rays and MRI scans, the orthopedic surgeon delivered devastating news. The hip joint was severely damaged, probably from decades of repetitive stress and a minor injury I had sustained years earlier but never properly treated. The surgeon explained that I needed immediate hip replacement surgery, and that delaying procedure would only make the condition worse. Without surgery, I would likely become bedridden within months and face serious complications from immobility. The surgery was scheduled for December 15th at Detroit Medical Center. As the date approached, I became increasingly anxious about the procedure and the recovery period. I had never had major surgery before, and the thought of being completely helpless for weeks while my hip healed terrified me. The surgeon explained that I would need several days in the hospital followed by weeks of physical therapy and limited mobility. Danny assured me that he would take care of everything while I was recovering. He offered to handle my bills, manage my medications, coordinate with a physical therapist, and take care of any emergencies that might arise. I was touched by his willingness to help and relieved to know that someone would be looking out for my interests while I was incapacitated. The night before surgery, Danny came to my apartment to go over the logistics of my care. We discussed which bills would need to be paid while I was in the hospital, how to contact my insurance company if there were any problems, and what to do if any emergencies arose. As we talked, Danny mentioned that it would be helpful if he had access to my bank account in case he needed to pay for anything urgently. At the time, this seemed like a reasonable precaution. I was going to be unconscious for hours during surgery and heavily medicated for days afterward. If there were any financial emergencies or unexpected expenses, Danny would need to be able to handle them immediately. So I gave him my debit card and wrote down my PIN number on a piece of paper, trusting him to use it only for legitimate expenses related to my care. I remember the exact words I used when I handed him the card. I told him this was only for emergencies, only if something urgent came up that couldn't wait for me to recover enough to handle it myself. I explained that my savings were modest but represented everything I had worked for my entire life, and that I was counting on that money to support me through retirement. Danny nodded solemnly and promised that he would guard my financial information carefully and use it only if absolutely necessary. The morning of surgery arrived gray and cold, typical for December in Detroit. Danny drove me to the hospital at 5:30 in the morning, and I was prepped for surgery by 7. The anesthesiologist explained the procedure, and the last thing I remember was Danny squeezing my hand and telling me that everything would be fine, that he would take care of everything while I was recovering. The surgery took longer than expected. What was supposed to be a routine hip replacement became complicated when the surgeon discovered additional damage that required more extensive repair work. I was under anesthesia for nearly 6 hours, and the recovery room nurse told me later that I was unconscious for several more hours after the procedure ended. When I finally woke up, it was nearly midnight. I was groggy, disoriented, and in considerable pain despite the medication. Danny was sitting beside my bed, and when he saw that I was awake, he smiled and told me that the surgery had gone well, that the doctor was pleased with the results, and that I should focus on resting and recovering. He seemed tired but relieved, and I was grateful that he had stayed with me through such a long and difficult day. Over the next 3 days in the hospital, Danny was a model of devoted care. He brought me magazines and books, helped me with meals when I was too weak to feed myself, and coordinated with the nurses and physical therapists. He updated me on phone calls from friends and neighbors who were concerned about my recovery, and he assured me that everything at home was under control. I was discharged on Friday morning and moved into Danny's apartment temporarily because my own place had too many stairs for someone recovering from hip surgery. Danny had set up a comfortable bed in his living room and arranged for a physical therapist to visit 3 times a week. He had also stocked a refrigerator with my favorite foods and picked up all of my prescriptions from the pharmacy. For the first 2 weeks of my recovery, everything seemed perfect. Danny was attentive and caring, helping me with daily activities that I couldn't manage on my own. He cooked my meals, helped me shower, drove me to follow-up appointments with the surgeon, and encouraged me through the painful process of physical therapy. I was touched by his dedication and felt guilty for all the times I had doubted his character over the years. It was during my 3rd week of recovery that I first tried to access my bank account. I wanted to pay Danny back for all the expenses he had covered during my hospitalization and recovery, and I also needed to pay some bills that were probably overdue by then. When I asked Danny to bring me my checkbook so I could write him a check, he seemed uncomfortable and suggested that we wait until I was feeling stronger before worrying about financial matters. But I insisted, explaining that I didn't want to fall behind on my bills or leave him covering expenses that were my responsibility. Finally, Danny brought me my laptop so I could check my account balance online and see exactly how much I owed him. When I logged into my banking website and saw the account balance, I thought there must be some kind of mistake. According to the bank's records, my account contained $37.14. This was impossible. Before surgery, I had $45,000 in that account, money I had been saving for years to support myself through retirement. I have been extremely careful with my finances since Helen's death, living modestly and saving every penny I could spare. I called Danny over and showed him the screen, asking if he could explain what had happened. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. Instead of confusion or concern, I saw guilt and defensiveness. He immediately began making excuses, claiming that there must be some error with the bank's computer system, that the money was probably just temporarily frozen or something like that. But I pressed him for details. I asked him to explain exactly what expenses he had paid and why they would have cost $45,000. That's when his story began to fall apart. He claimed that there had been unexpected medical expenses not covered by insurance, that my apartment rent had increased dramatically, that there had been emergency repairs to my car, and various other expenses that supposedly justified emptying my entire life savings. When I pointed out that none of these explanations made sense, that my insurance had excellent coverage and my rent was paid through automatic withdrawal, Danny became angry and defensive. He accused me of not trusting him after everything he had done for me. He reminded me that he had sacrificed weeks of his own time to take care of me, that he had put his own life on hold to help me recover from surgery. But I wasn't going to be manipulated by guilt. I demanded that he show me receipts for every penny he had spent from my account. I wanted documentation of every expense, every bill payment, every medical cost that had supposedly consumed my entire life savings. Danny's response was to claim that he had lost most of the receipts, that he had been too busy taking care of me to keep careful records, that he would try to recreate the expenses from memory. Over the next several days, as my suspicions grew stronger and Danny's explanations became more elaborate and contradictory, the horrible truth began to emerge. There had been no emergency medical expenses, no dramatic rent increase, no car repairs. Danny had simply stolen my money, using the debit card and PIN number I had entrusted to him for emergencies to systematically drain my account while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed. When I confronted him with the evidence of his theft, Danny's entire demeanor changed. The caring, devoted son who had been nursing me back to health disappeared, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. He claimed that I had given him the money voluntarily, that I had told him he could have it as payment for taking care of me. When I reminded him that I had specifically said the card was only for emergencies, he argued that my care had been an emergency situation that justified accessing my funds. The discovery of Danny's betrayal was more painful than the hip surgery itself. This wasn't just theft. It was a violation of trust so fundamental that it shook my faith in my own judgment. I had raised this man, loved him unconditionally, supported him through countless difficulties, and believed that despite his flaws, he would never deliberately harm me. Learning that he had robbed me while I was at my most vulnerable felt like discovering that my entire relationship with my son had been built on lies. But the emotional pain was only part of the problem. At 69 years old, recovering from major surgery and with limited mobility, I was now virtually penniless. My Social Security payments would barely cover basic living expenses, and I had no other significant assets to fall back on. The money Danny had stolen represented my entire financial security for the rest of my life. I had no choice but to report the theft to police, though doing so felt like betraying my own child. The detective who took my statement was sympathetic, but explained that cases involving family members were always complicated, especially when the accused person had been given legitimate access to the victim's financial accounts. Danny's claim that I had given him permission to use the money would make prosecution difficult, even though I had clear evidence that he had far exceeded any reasonable interpretation of our agreement. The legal process was slow and frustrating. Danny hired a lawyer who argued that I had voluntarily given my son access to my finances, and that any misunderstanding about the scope of that access was a civil matter rather than a criminal one. My own attorney explained that while Danny had clearly committed theft, proving criminal intent in a family situation where there had been legitimate financial arrangements was challenging. Meanwhile, I was struggling to survive on my drastically reduced income. I had to move out of Danny's apartment and find a cheaper place to live, settling for a small, run-down apartment in a less safe neighborhood. I couldn't afford the physical therapy sessions that would have helped my recovery, and I had to cut back on medications that weren't fully covered by my insurance. The stress of financial hardship was slowing my healing and making my depression worse. The most heartbreaking part of the situation was the complete breakdown of my relationship with Danny. Not only had he stolen my life savings, but he showed no remorse for what he had done. He seemed to genuinely believe that he was entitled to my money as compensation for the care he had provided during my recovery. When I tried to explain how his actions had devastated my financial security and my trust in him, He became angry and accused me of being ungrateful and unreasonable. Sarah flew in from California when she learned what had happened, and she was horrified by Danny's actions. She offered to help me financially, but her own family expenses limited what she could provide. She also tried to mediate between Danny and me, hoping that he might acknowledge his wrongdoing and find a way to return at least some of the money he had taken. But Danny refused to admit that he had done anything wrong and showed no interest in making amends. As months passed and the legal case dragged on, I began to lose hope that I would ever recover my money or rebuild my relationship with my son. The criminal charges against Danny were eventually reduced to a misdemeanor, and he received probation and community service rather than jail time. The court ordered him to make restitution, but since he had no significant assets and limited income, the likelihood of recovering any substantial amount seemed remote. I had resigned myself to living out my remaining years in poverty, supported only by Social Security and whatever small amount Sarah could contribute to my care. The betrayal had left me not just financially devastated, but emotionally broken, unable to trust anyone and constantly worry about my security and independence. But then something extraordinary happened that I never could have anticipated. About 8 months after the theft, I received a call from a lawyer I had never heard of, representing what he described as a class action lawsuit against a company I didn't recognize. He explained that I had been identified as someone who might be eligible for compensation related to a data breach that had occurred several years earlier at a financial services company that had managed some of my retirement investments. Initially, I was skeptical, thinking this might be some kind of scam targeting elderly victims. But the lawyer provided detailed documentation showing that I had indeed been affected by this breach and that the company had reached a settlement agreement that would provide compensation to affected customers. The amount I would receive was substantial, far more than I had dared to hope for since losing my savings. The settlement process took several more months to complete, but eventually I received a check for $68,000, significantly more than Danny had stolen from me. For the first time in nearly a year, I felt financial security returning to my life. I was able to move into a better apartment, resume proper medical care for my hip, and begin rebuilding a retirement fund that would support me for the rest of my life. But even more meaningful than the financial windfall was the restoration of my faith in the possibility of justice and recovery. The settlement reminded me that sometimes, when everything seems hopeless, unexpected solutions can emerge from directions you never anticipated. While I couldn't undo Danny's betrayal or restore our relationship, I could move forward with dignity and independence. The experience also connected me with other elderly victims of financial abuse, and I became involved with advocacy organizations that work to protect seniors from exploitation by family members and caregivers. I learned that my story was far from unique, that thousands of elderly Americans are robbed by their own children and relatives every year, often during periods of illness or vulnerability, when they are least able to protect themselves. Today, I'm financially secure again, though I remain estranged from Danny. He has made no effort to apologize or make amends, and I've accepted that our relationship may never recover from his betrayal. But I've also learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about the people who genuinely care for your welfare and treat you with respect and honesty. Sarah and I have grown closer through this ordeal, and I've developed meaningful friendships with other seniors who understand the challenges of aging and the importance of mutual support. I've also found purpose in sharing my story and educating other elderly people about the warning signs of financial abuse and the resources available to help victims. My hip has healed well, and while I'll never be as mobile as I once was, I'm able to live independently and maintain an active social life. The money from the settlement has allowed me to plan for a comfortable retirement and even leave something meaningful to Sarah and my grandchildren. Most importantly, I've learned that while betrayal by those we love is devastating, it doesn't have to define the rest of our lives. Recovery is possible, both financially and emotionally, even when everything seems hopeless. Sometimes justice comes from unexpected sources, and sometimes the worst experiences in our lives can lead us to discover strength and resilience we never knew we possessed. That's my story. How my son robbed me while I was helpless on an operating table, but how an unexpected miracle gave me a second chance at financial security and emotional healing. Sometimes the people who should protect us become our greatest threats, but sometimes the universe finds a way to restore what was stolen and give us hope for the future.